On April 2, 1917, President Wilson stood before a special session of senators and representatives and solemnly asked Congress to recognize that a state of war existed between Germany and the United States. His speech condemned Germany's submarine policy as warfare against mankind and declared the world must be made safe for democracy. On April 6th, an overwhelming majority in Congress voted for a declaration of war, although a few pacifists, including Robert La Follette, defiantly voted no. U.S. mobilization for war in 1917 was a race against time. Germany was preparing to deliver a knockout blow to end the war on German terms. Could the United States mobilize its vast economic resources fast enough to make a difference? That was the question Wilson and his advisors confronted in the critical early months of U.S. involvement of war. Paying for the costly war was presenting a huge challenge. Wilson's war government managed to raise $33 billion in 2 years by a combination of loans and taxes. It conducted 4 massive drives to convince Americans to put their savings into federal government Liberty bonds. Congress also increased both personal income and corporate taxes, and placed an excise tax on luxury goods. The U.S. government used techniques of both patriotic persuasion and legal intimidation to ensure public support for the war effort. A journalist named George Creel took charge of a propaganda agency called the Committee on Public Information. This committee enlisted the voluntary services of artists, writers, vaudeville performers, and movie stars to depict the heroism of the boys and the villainy of the Kaiser. They created films, posters, pamphlets, and volunteer speakers, all urging Americans to watch out for German spies and do your bit for the war. War hysteria and patriotic enthusiasm provided an excuse for nativist groups to take out their prejudices by charging minorities with disloyalty. One such group, the American Protective League, mounted Hate the Hun campaigns and used vigilante actions to attack all things German, from the performing of Beethoven's music to the cooking of sauerkraut. Under the order of the U.S. Secretary of Labor, manufacturers of war materials could refuse to hire and could fire American citizens of German extraction. A number of socialists and pacifists bravely risked criticizing the government's war policy. The Espionage Act of 1917 provided for imprisonment of up to 20 years for persons who either tried to incite rebellion in the armed forces or obstruct the operation of the draft. The Sedition Act of 1918 went much further by prohibiting anyone from making disloyal or abusive remarks about the U.S. government. About 2,000 people were prosecuted under these laws, half of whom were convicted in jails. Among them was the socialist leader Eugene Debs, who was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for speaking against the war. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Espionage Act in a case involving a man who had been imprisoned for distributing pamphlets against the draft. In 1919, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes concluded that the right to free speech could be limited when it represented a clear and present danger to the public safety. As soon as war was declared, thousands of young men voluntarily enlisted for military service. Still, the military felt it needed more soldiers and sailors. To meet this need, Secretary of War Newton D. Baker devised a selective service system to conscript or draft men into the military. He wanted a democratic method run by local boards for ensuring that all groups in the population would be called into service. The government required all men between 21 and 30, and later between 18 and 45, to register for possible induction into the military. Under the Selective Service Act, about 2.8 million men were eventually called by lottery, in addition to the almost 2 million men who volunteered to serve. About half of all those in uniform made it to the Western Front. Racial segregation applied to the Army as it did to civilian life. Almost 400,000 African Americans served in World War I in segregated units. Only a few were permitted to be officers, and all were barred from the Marine Corps. Nevertheless, W.E.B. Du Bois believed that the record of service by African Americans fighting to make the world safe for democracy would earn them equal rights at home when the war ended. However, he would be bitterly disappointed. All groups in American society, business and labor, women and men, immigrants and native-born, had to adjust to the realities of a wartime economy. As men were drafted into the military, the jobs they vacated were often taken by women, thousands of whom entered the workforce for the first time. Women's contributions to the war effort, both as volunteers and wage earners, finally convinced Wilson and Congress to support the 19th Amendment. Job opportunities in wartime America, together with the upheavals of the Revolution in Mexico, caused thousands of Mexicans to cross the border to work in agriculture and mining. Most were employed in the Southwest, but a significant number also traveled to the Midwest for factory jobs. African Americans also took advantage of job opportunities opened up by the war and migrated north. By the time the U.S. troops were shipped overseas in late 1917, millions of European soldiers on both sides had already died in trench warfare, made more murderous in the industrial age by heavy artillery, machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes. A second revolution in Russia by Bolsheviks or communists took that nation out of the war. With no Eastern Front to divide its forces, Germany concentrated on one all-out push to break through Allied lines in France. Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare was having its intended effect. Merchant ships bound for Britain were being sunk at a staggering rate. 900,000 tons of shipping was lost in just 1 month. That's April of 1917. The U.S. response to the Allied emergency was to undertake a record-setting program of ship construction. The U.S. Navy also implemented a convoy system of armed escorts for groups of merchant ships. By the end of 1917, the system was working well enough to ensure that Britain and France would not be starved into submission. Unable to imagine the grim realities of trench warfare, U.S. troops were eager for action. The American Expeditionary Force was commanded by General John J. Pershing. The first U.S. troops to see action were used to plug weaknesses in the French and British lines. But by the summer of 1918, as American forces arrived by the hundreds of thousands, the AEF assumed independent responsibility for one segment of the Western Front. Enough U.S. troops were in place in spring of 1918 to hold the line against the last ferocious assault by German forces. In August, September, and October, an Allied offensive along the Meuse River and through the Argonne forests succeeded in driving an exhausted German army backward toward the German border. U.S. troops participated in this drive. On November 11, 1918, the Germans signed an armistice in which they agreed to surrender their arms, give up much of their navy, and evacuate Allied-occupied territories. After only a few months of fighting, U.S. combat deaths totaled nearly 49,000. Many more thousands died of disease, including a flu epidemic in the training camps, bringing total U.S. fatalities in World War I to 112,432. During the war, Woodrow Wilson never lost sight of his ambition to shape the peace settlement when the war ended. In January 1917, he had said that the United States would insist on peace without victory. A year later, he presented to Congress a detailed list of war aims, known as the 14 Points, designed to address the causes of World War I and prevent another war. Several of the President's 14 points related to specific territorial questions. For example, Germany had to return the regions of Alsace and Lorraine to France, and to evacuate Belgium in the west, and Romania and Serbia in the east. Of greater significance were some of Wilson's broad principles for securing the peace, such as the recognition of freedom of the seas, the end to the practice of making secret treaties, the reduction of national armaments, the idea of an impartial adjustment of all colonial claims, self-determination for the various nationalities, the removal of trade barriers, and a general association of nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. That last point was the one that Wilson valued the most. The International Peace Association that he envisioned would soon be named the League of Nations. The peace conference following the armistice took place in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris, beginning in January 1919. Every nation that had fought on the Allied side in the war was represented. No U.S. president had ever traveled abroad to attend a diplomatic conference, but President Wilson decided that his personal participation at Versailles was vital to defending his 14 points. Republicans criticized him for being accompanied to Paris by several Democrats, but only one Republican, whose advice was never sought. Other heads of state at Versailles made it clear that their nations wanted both revenge against Germany and compensation in the form of indemnities and territory. They did not share Wilson's idealism, which called for a peace without victory. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, George Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy met with Wilson almost daily as the Big Four. After months of argument, the president reluctantly agreed to the compromise on most of his 14 points. He insisted, however, that the other delegations accept his plan for a League of Nations. When the peace conference adjourned in June of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles included the following terms. Germany was disarmed and stripped of its colonies in Asia and Africa. It was also forced to admit guilt for the war, accept French occupation of the Rhineland for 15 years, and pay a huge sum of money in reparations to Great Britain and France. The Treaty of Versailles also applied the principle of self-determination to territories that were once controlled by Germany. So independence was granted to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and Poland, and the new nations of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were also established. The signers of the treaty would join an international peacekeeping organization, the League of Nations. Article 10 of the Covenant, or Charter of the League, called on each member nation to stand ready to protect the independence and territorial integrity of the other nations. So upon returning to the United States, President Wilson had to win approval of 2/3 of the Senate for all parts of the Treaty of Versailles, including that last part, which was the League of Nations, his baby. Republican senators raised objections to the League, especially to Article 10, or the League of Nations. They argued that U.S. membership in such a body might interfere with U.S. sovereignty, and might also cause European nations to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. Wilson made winning Senate ratification difficult. In October of 1918, he had asked voters to support Democrats in the midterm elections as an act of patriotic loyalty. This political appeal had backfired badly. In the 1918 election, Republicans had won a solid majority in the House and a majority of 2 in the Senate. In 1919, Wilson needed Republican votes in the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Instead, he faced the determined hostility of a leading Senate Republican, Henry Cabot Lodge. Senators opposed to the Treaty of Versailles formed 2 groups. The irreconcilable faction could not accept U.S. membership in the League, no matter how the covenant was worded. The reservationist faction, a larger group led by Senator Lodge, said they could accept the League if certain reservations were added to the covenant. Wilson had the option of either accepting Lodge's reservations or fighting for the treaty as it stood. He chose to fight. Believing that his policy could prevail if he could personally rally public support, Wilson boarded a train and went on an arduous speaking tour to the West to make speeches for the League of Nations. And then in the fall of 1919, he collapsed after delivering a speech in Colorado. He returned to Washington. A few days later, suffered a massive stroke from which he never fully recovered. The Senate defeated the treaty without reservations. So